Good evening. I'm Mike Knetter, and welcome to the UW Now Livestream series, where we bring you experts from the UW community to talk about various aspects of the COVID-19 crisis. Welcome in particular to our special Michigan edition of the show. More on that later. Since the pandemic began, the world has been racing to learn as much as we can about the virus. Massive amounts of data have been collected, but how do we process and interpret the data in order to best inform decisions being made every day by governments, public health officials, businesses, and higher education institutions, to name a few? Joining me this evening are two experts who will discuss how data impacts our understanding of and response to the pandemic. Remzi Arpaci-Dusseau is the Grace Waba Professor and Chair of Computer Sciences at UW-Madison. And Eric Lefkofsky is the founder and CEO of Tempest, a data-driven precision medicine company based in Chicago. This evening, we remind you to please use the chat feature on YouTube to ask your questions as they are presenting and in the Q&A after. And after their remarks, we'll go to your questions and engage Eric and Remzi in a dialogue. Looking forward to it. So first up this evening, we'll have Remzi Arpaci-Dusseau. And as I mentioned, Remzi is the chair of computer sciences at UW-Madison and the Grace Waba Professor. And what's significant about that is computer sciences is now part of a larger set of departments that have formed a new school of computing, data, and information at UW-Madison. And that's something we'll talk about a bit this evening. As a leading computer systems researcher, Remzi's work focuses on the future of data storage. He co-leads a research group with Professor Andrea Arpaci-Dusseau, and together they've graduated 25 PhD students and won numerous awards. Many of their innovations are used by commercial systems. Andrea and Remzi's operating systems book, 3 Easy Pieces, is downloaded millions of times yearly and used at hundreds of institutions worldwide. They received the 2018 ACM Mark Weiser Award for Outstanding Leadership, Innovation, and Impact in Storage and Computer Systems Research. Remzi is a decorated teacher at UW-Madison, winning numerous departmental and university-wide awards, including the Chancellor's Distinguished Teaching Award. Remzi, I am hopeful you can even teach me something about computing and data science tonight. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to hearing your remarks.
Thanks, Mike, for the generous introduction. I'm not sure I'll live up to it, but I'll give it my best. So before we get into, I think, the health-related sides of this, I thought what I would spend a little bit of time talking about is the data revolution that's really going on in society right now. I'd given a similar talk about this once some time back, and a wise alumni came up to me afterwards and said, you know, it seemed like a great talk, but what is data? So I realized at this point that it might be good to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page when we're talking about the data revolution that's going on and understanding what that means for the university, for industry, and really for society at large. I think if you think about what data is, it's just information. That's all we're ever talking about when we're talking about data. And the reason there's a data revolution or an information revolution going on right now is for a number of reasons. The first reason, which I thought I'd share with you, is really that we have the ability to collect so much more data or information than we ever have before. So this, you can think of many, many examples of this across all facets of society. An example, for example, when you go to a store like Target, it might be that a shopping cart actually pays attention to where you are driving that shopping cart around the store, so that when you check out, it can say something, it can record something about that, which is interesting for so many reasons, both from a privacy angle as well as just new information about how people shop. There are health-related applications, and I'm sure we'll talk about that more tonight. There's a company I heard of called Kinsa, where they make a thermometer, and the thermometer is just like any other digital thermometer, except it records your temperature and then sends it back to a centralized database. So therefore, a company then can have, or any other institution that has access to that information, can have a better global sense of the health of millions of people, and when people are getting fevers, when things are kind of going bad for them. And of course, we're used to many other forms of data that's out there that's being generated all the time, from the websites you visit to the ads you click on, and the whole world of computer systems that have really changed in the past so many years. So there is a data explosion. There's just so much data being generated. But we wouldn't be in the midst of a data revolution if that was all that was happening. There was just a lot of data out there, because we need to be able to do something with that data. And that's really where the world comes closer to the expertise that I have spent years working in, which is the world of computer systems. So we need to be able to, specifically, we need to be able to analyze all of that data. We have huge amounts of data about all of these different areas that I just mentioned, but we need computer systems to be able to look through that data and find interesting things out about it. You can take any of those examples and that I mentioned before, like going to a store and where you walk around trying to figure out maybe a better store layout so as to sell more products, something like that. Or in a health-related application, you can imagine doing some kind of analysis, trying to figure out, is the fact that fevers are spiking in this part of the country, is that related to COVID, or is that really just a normal flu season kicking in? And you could kind of think of many other related examples. And so having computing power, a large amount of computing power available, is necessary to deal with huge amounts of data. The amazing thing that's happened there is, over the past few decades, we've gone from it being very expensive to set up large computer systems and manage them to do things to that becoming very, very inexpensive. And that's due to a technology that many of you have probably heard of, called the cloud. The cloud is just companies like Amazon and Google building huge scale computer systems with millions of computers in them, and then renting them to you as you need them. So if you need thousands of computers to analyze your data on a moment's notice, you can do that now for a very small amount of money by just renting them from, say, Amazon or Microsoft or wherever. In the past, 20 years ago, that wasn't the case. You'd have to go out, you'd have to buy hundreds or thousands of computers, you'd have to figure out how to run them, you'd have all the costs associated with that, which would cost you millions of dollars. Now you can do that for hundreds or thousands of dollars when you need it, and then when you don't need it, you don't need to use them anymore. So the cloud and access to large-scale computing is another part of the data revolution that's going on. The third thing I wanted to talk about is the kind of another computer science thing that touches on the data revolution, which is, you've heard of in different forms. You've heard of artificial intelligence probably, or machine learning. And all that's talking about are algorithms that take that data and run across these large-scale computer systems and then turn them into some kind of useful output. Now, machine learning algorithms have been around for decades. In fact, the earliest neural networks, which is an early form of artificial intelligence, were proposed in the 1940s. And even modern neural networks that people use to analyze lots of different data sets go back many decades. The techniques have been around forever. What hasn't been around is the large-scale data and the large-scale computing. So the combination of the machine learning techniques that people have been working on for decades, large-scale computing power, and then the data that is interesting, large-scale data sets, the combination of those three are leading to all sorts of innovations. And those innovations are, like I said, in industry, they're touching on health, they're touching on all sorts of science. I saw a fabulous talk the other week. It was about how chemistry is being revolutionized by machine learning and large-scale data processing, being able to solve problems in the world of chemistry that they've never been able to tackle before. So I think we're seeing this very wide-scale revolution because of those things. Now, I don't want to take too long, but I think one natural issue that hopefully we'll talk about a little bit more tonight is one that naturally cuts across the world of data, which is related to privacy. I think anytime data is being collected, we have a responsibility in society to think about, is it good that the data is being collected? And how do we address those concerns? And I think that that'll be something we touch on tonight, but it's really something society needs to grapple with at many different levels. I'll give one example. For example, some years back, Netflix was running this competition to see who could best, given some ratings of movies, who could best basically predict what movie you would like to see next. That's a core Netflix kind of data-driven machine learning driven feature. And so they wanted to share that idea, allow other people to participate that, because maybe some researcher, someone will come up with a great idea that predicts better than the Netflix scientists themselves could. And so what they did is they anonymized the data. They basically took out the names from the data set, and they said, here's all these rankings of movies, but we've anonymized it, no problem. And of course, what happened is some clever computer scientists started working on that and quickly de-anonymized the whole data set, because they could find other places where those same users had ranked some movies, and it was pretty easy then to identify who those people were. So, and then let's think about some other cases that I was mentioning. For example, in health, you can imagine any data that you're generating, you want to be very careful about its privacy. Or even something like when I'm going to a store like Walmart or Target, how much do I really want to be shared and stored by those companies? Those are very central problems that we need to face. There are technical solutions, and there's to some of those problems, and computer scientists have been working on that for a long time, but I think it's also a broader concern. And so that's certainly something that's going to influence society, but I think it's also something that is changing how we think about education. So in any case, there's a lot more I could talk about in this space, but I hope I've given you a sense of the data revolution that is going on right now. Again, because there's so much data in every facet of what we're doing, because we have the computing power, and because there are computing algorithms that can use that power to analyze that data, I think that's why we are where we are today. And maybe I'll stop at this point and we can go from there.
Well, that's sure to stimulate a few questions. Thanks for teeing that up. You've already answered my most important question about, what are the key ingredients of the big data revolution? So appreciate that kind of tour through all of those building blocks. That was fantastic.
Oh,
thank you, Remzi. And next, we'll hear from Eric Lefkofsky, who, as I mentioned earlier, is the founder and CEO at Tempest, a leading provider of technology-enabled precision medicine solutions. Eric's also the founding partner of Lightbank, a venture fund investing in disruptive technology businesses, which is a space Eric knows well from his own personal experience. Many know Eric as co-founder of Groupon, a digital marketplace linking groups of customers and local businesses, but he's also helped found MediaOcean, a leading provider of integrated media procurement technology, Echo Global Logistics, a technology-enabled transportation and logistics outsourcing firm, and Interworkings, a global provider of managed print and promotional solutions. Importantly, Eric also co-chairs the Lefkofsky Family Foundation with his wife, Liz, who is a Badger class of 1991. And through that work, they advance high-impact initiatives that enhance the lives in the communities that they serve. Eric is also an adjunct professor at the University of Chicago and the author of Accelerated Disruption, Understanding the True Speed of Innovation. Eric, thank you for being here with us tonight. Really appreciate having you on our show and would love to hear your opening thoughts about the revolution in data science and especially how you see it as an innovator, an entrepreneur, and someone now working hard in the field of medicine.
No, thanks for having me. So I think where I'll start is just maybe a little bit of my background, how I got here, and just take you through a tour of how I got into healthcare, and then we can talk a little bit about COVID and try to weave it back to big data, which is the theme of this evening. So I've been in technology since 1999, and I've had a kind of a front row seat watching the birth of the internet, the birth of mobile, the birth of social. And what I would say, and what I've said before, is that, in my opinion, as somebody who spent 25 years building technology companies, all of those are going to seem, I think, tiny compared to the big data and AI revolution that's coming to healthcare. It's unlike anything I've seen, and I believe in the future we'll actually look back at this moment as almost defined by the age of the molecule, where people will say, before the molecular era, there was disease and there was death and there was, food allergies and pain and suffering and COVID. and things of that nature. And post the molecular era, these things will largely disappear. And they'll largely disappear because of big data, the influence of technology, and artificial intelligence. So just for a moment, as it relates to healthcare, some of the underlying technologies that make this possible are part of a larger technology backdrop. Cloud computing, which we just talked about a second ago, the ability to store vast amounts of data at low cost, really developed not for healthcare, but developed for enterprise software applications, developed by people like Amazon for e-commerce and the internet, for Netflix. That cloud computing allows us to basically store and compute at very low cost. And so that's one of the building blocks of bringing technology to healthcare. Another is advancements in artificial intelligence as it relates to imagery, namely optical character recognition, tools like natural language processing, voice recognition capability, all of which were developed, again, not for healthcare, but for the social things we interact with all day long. Facebook, Instagram, Google, Apple, they built all these tools so we could find our friends, find photographs, but these tools that allow us to digitize and peer inside images are also necessary to bring AI to healthcare. And the third component of this is low-cost molecular profiling. About 20 years ago, we sequenced the first human genome, and at that time, it was very expensive to generate genomic data. But companies like Alumni and others have done an amazing job at radically reducing our cost to generate molecular data. And so what used to cost $1 million 15 years ago costs $1 today. It's literally a millionfold reduction. And so all of a sudden we can generate vast amounts of molecular data at low cost. So low cost cloud computing, all these low cost tools in imaging, and all this low cost molecular profiling allow us to basically amass these incredible data sets that were impossible to amass before in healthcare, and really kind of peer inside the human body and figure out what is driving these diseases. So as it relates to my own background, I got into technology a little over 5 years ago. My wife, who is a Badger, was diagnosed with breast cancer, and I was perplexed at how little data was a part of her care. I used to say to people, there was all this technology surrounding us. At the time I had a Tesla car and I had an iPhone, and I felt like I was firmly in the 21st century. We would pull into the hospital and it was almost like being teleported back in time. And so I thought to myself, this is crazy that technology has just not permeated healthcare the same way it's permeated other parts of our life. I mean, you literally can pick up your phone and find any restaurant you want to find and see a million photographs of the menu and get reviews. And yet we don't give physicians making life and death decisions that same access to real-time data. And so I decided to kind of leave all the things I was doing in my prior life, including Groupon, and focus entirely on healthcare and trying to basically solve this one problem, which was, could we amass in real time the necessary data sets that would allow us to make data-driven decisions, and therefore usher in an era of artificial intelligence in healthcare. In our case, we got fixated on this notion of AI-enabled diagnostics, meaning using vast amounts of data. In our world, it's typically referred to as phenotypic, morphologic, and molecular data, which is a fancy word for text, images, and molecules. But could we get healthcare record data from inside these EHR systems? Could we get healthcare record data that's locked inside pathology slides and radiology scans? Could we get molecular data by sequencing patients? And if we put all that together, could we try to figure out in real time what's the optimal therapeutic path for any one given patient? Instead of just treating us like we're all the same, could we actually try to figure out how to navigate people on a truly precise or truly personalized therapeutic path? So we started Tempest to do that. We're 5 years old. We have about almost 1,600 people today on that problem. So we've achieved some real scale. These are computer scientists and AI engineers and computational biologists and bioinformaticians and genomicists and all kinds of amazing people that come together to try to bring AI to healthcare. We're focused today on cancer, depression, infectious disease, COVID, which I'll talk about in a second. And we recently got into cardiology, and I'll spend 1 minute on cardiology just because I think it provides an interesting example of how technology is going to influence healthcare. So in this country today, we run hundreds of millions of EKGs a year. Someone wires you up and we do an EKG, it's the squiggly lines that you would see. And this is one of the major tests that we run to determine if somebody is having a heart issue. About 3% of patients who get a normal EKG, which means they're told to go home, they're fine, end up within about 12 months having a heart attack or a stroke. And it turns out that this was historically very hard to predict, and so these patients went untreated. But with machine learning and AI, we actually can build models to predict who those patients are. And so we have built a model which we recently have packaged up to be submitted to the FDA, which predicts with almost 90% accuracy those patients that are going to have a stroke or a heart attack within 1 year, even though they've had a normal EKG. And as you can imagine, this is a huge number of patients. And the intervention is actually very easy. Put them on a statin or a beta blocker, have the patient get a stress test. There's all kinds of very easy medications or subsequent tests you can run to keep these patients healthy and alive and doing great, instead of not knowing they're going to have a heart attack or have a stroke until it's too late. In our case, we got into COVID, and then I'll be done. We got into COVID because we were asked to apply our technology in March to this problem by the government and a whole bunch of other folks. And, we were running these very large scale labs, running almost 2 million tests a year. It's a huge group of people, bringing AI to healthcare. And we were asked to kind of stop doing what we were doing and start thinking about COVID. And so we began running a PCR profiling, which is the most common test that you would give somebody who might have COVID. And so we scaled up our lab to get, we're running about 10,000 tests a day or something. So we become a fairly large tester of COVID patients. But just running the COVID test is not that exciting. What's exciting is collecting, as we do, longitudinal outcome and response data and other data about those patients, that phenotypic data I mentioned, which is essentially saying, who are these patients? What are their characteristics? And COVID's a really interesting example to think about big data in healthcare, because typically, you don't, it's hard to what does it mean for me? But everyone kind of gets what it means to have a positive COVID test. And what you want to know when you have a positive COVID test is not, I'm positive or negative. I mean, that's fine. But what you really want to know is, if I'm positive, what's going to happen to me? Am I going to be asymptomatic and positive? Am I going to have a mild case and positive? Or am I going to end up in the hospital and need a ventilator? Or God forbid, might I succumb to the disease? And again, over time, we'll be able to build mathematical models that stratify patients based upon their characteristics to be able to say, these are patients that will or won't respond to drugs like remdesivir or IL-6 inhibitors. These are patients who are at acutely high risk because they have hypertension or type 2 diabetes or cardiac disease versus other patients who aren't. And that's really what you want. You want a diagnostic test that isn't stupid and just says you're positive or negative, but you want it to actually tell you what to do next. And that is both the promise and the power of AI in healthcare.
Well, Eric, can you tell me, are we making some progress on being able to tell people what their positive test means, and how long would that take?
It's really interesting. I mean, one of the challenges we have in healthcare in particular is, and not to digress too far, but The great hospitals in this country, the great academic medical centers, UW included, were connected to these large universities. Now, historically, however that came to be. And one of the challenges we have with large academic institutions is that they tend to be fairly risk averse. They're often protecting a brand in an institution that is 100 or 200 years old. And they have a real sense of fear when it comes to doing anything that might put the institution at risk. The challenge is innovation by its very nature can't tolerate that. Change is risky. And so one of the biggest problems we've had, which is amazing, is even in the midst of a global pandemic, it has been very hard for academic medical centers and large hospitals to turn over data relative to these patients, even though I think they all would admit we need to turn over this data to figure out what's going on. And so I think the answer to your question is it's going to take us some time, not because we couldn't build the models. We could build the models in weeks. It's really getting the data.
You know, Eric, if I could stay with you for a minute while we're on some of these topics, you said something that struck me as very interesting, that you felt you were teleported back to an earlier era when you brought Liz in to be treated. And, you know, is our U.S. healthcare system a help or a hindrance in trying to make these medical advances? It does seem like, you know, while we might have some hindrance, maybe other countries, it's a similar problem. Do you have any thoughts about that? How would, you know, where would this innovation take place more naturally?
Yeah, I mean, in the aggregate, it's by far the best healthcare system, I think, in the world. And in the aggregate, you know, if you got a problem, you want to be treated, you know, at UW's hospital, not, you know, in Indonesia or in, you know, some other country, right? Even, by the way, throughout Europe, which is super advanced. So I think in general, it's the envy of the world in terms of high quality care dispensed at the top of the curve. When you go down, you know, from into the community setting, I think it does level out much more to other parts of the world. But you know, it still is an amazing healthcare institution. The challenge is that it's an institution that's very good at dispensing care within the existing paradigm, which is I have an idea, I run some kind of trial, I prove prospectively that my idea works. That takes, like, I don't know, 10 years. I publish or I seek regulatory approval, and then it becomes adopted as the standard. When you have a disease like COVID, you have no time for that. And so what you're watching when you watch this kind of craziness with the CDC and the FDA and emergency use authorizations and all up and down, and take hydrochloroquine, don't take it, do this, don't, is that our system is very bad at adopting to this kind of rapid change, whereas the Chinese system is very good at this. It's like this, where they're weak, we're strong, where we're strong, they're weak. And so hopefully both systems over time can learn from one another.
Let me shift back to Remzi for a minute. Remzi, you kind of walked us through the pillars of the big data revolution, exactly what made it a revolution. And I think you talked about, you know, our ability to collect data has grown immensely. We've got better processing power. We have artificial intelligence and machine learning techniques. Are we as good at data analysis as we are at collecting data? You know, as someone who went through a social science curriculum in economics, you know, we put a lot of structure around the data because some variables are a little bit more exogenous than others, and that might influence how you look at the data and what inferences you can really draw from the data. Have those tools of data analysis kept up with some of the other advances in storage and just processing horsepower?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think Eric kind of hinted at this. You know, a lot of the technology that's been developed is pretty generic technology. So, you know, being able to identify that there's a kitten in a photo, right, is a deep learning task. And it just turns out the types of training that you do and the data-driven algorithms in that space are widely applicable. So, so I think there has been a lot of progress in that space, and it's you know, I guess I would say there's still plenty more things to do. You know, we just hired, for example, in our department, we've been hiring faculty who have a lot of expertise in this area. That's been certainly an important thing for really any top computer science department. And there's so many problems they still can't solve because, you know, even the techniques that they're using are still, you know, the first tens of years that we've been doing these things. It's not like we've been doing it like for hundreds of years, like many of our other disciplines. So I think there will be many more advances, but it's just remarkable actually how much in the last, you know, 10, 15 years ago, recognizing people in photos, translating language, doing even things like character recognition, a bunch of things Eric was talking about. Those are hard problems, and people had bad approaches, basically, approaches that just didn't work. And I remember even my first years at UW, I would see a faculty candidate come give a talk about how their technique improved, you know, language understanding from 22% to 23%, and it was considered a big advance. And then as all this new technology and this data-driven approach with deep learning and it really swept through about 10 plus years ago, suddenly all those bad techniques got swept away and basically stuff worked. And so now what we're really exploring, we're in this era of exploring how many problems can we solve with the techniques that we've been developing.
Great, thank you. Eric, anything you want to add to that?
I mean, no, I think it's totally right. I mean, you know, we're in this moment in time where there's a confluence of all kinds of stuff that happened, and you know, I think depending on who you are, you know, I'm on the application side of this, not the raw science of it, but you know, you're just super excited, no matter who you are, at applying these tools to the problem at hand. So if you're Elon Musk, you're loving applying these tools to, you know, energy efficient vehicles or space travel. If you're somebody who's into clean tech, or if you're whoever, you know. And so for me, I get excited about applying these tools to healthcare. You know, I don't think we know where they're going to go. I don't think any of us would have saw, certainly, I think you would ask Remzi and I, who've both been in this for a while, what the world would look like today. It would have been very hard 20 years ago to see some of these advancements. Others you would have seen, but some of them have just been, it's staggering the pace. And the pace of some of these advancements seems to be accelerating. And so it's very hard to predict where we'll be 20 years from now. But I do think there's a growing sentiment that we might finally be at a point where at least certain components of machine learning and AI are going to have like a really important impact on our life in a way beyond just some of the, you know, picking a better Netflix movie, but in terms of things like keeping us alive or reducing our energy burden and reducing, you know, global warming, you know, things of that nature. And I think we're close to some of those.
And I guess one of the big trade-offs is something Remzi spoke about at the end, which is, you know, I suppose ideally for medicine, we could learn a lot more if everyone allowed us to know everything about what happened in their day, what they ate, where they went, how much exercise they're getting, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, if we had all that information, you know, I would think we could do much better medical studies about, you know, which foods are really good at maybe preventing cancer or, you know, promoting longevity, et cetera. But there's probably limits to how much we can do that. How do you think that will unfold? How much information can we realistically get from individuals to make these advances? And which government agencies are going to be in charge of deciding how much is too much? Eric, do you have thoughts on that? How this would be regulated and what are the limits of data privacy in medicine?
I mean, I can take the healthcare piece, and then I'm sure Remzi has comments on just the rest on other industries. But in terms of healthcare, you know, look, it's really, you know, it's one of the few areas, honestly, that I think, and I, you know, don't say this very often, but where regulation at the government level has been, I think, quite effective. I mean, if you look at the amount of data that flows freely regarding personal data at companies like, and all of them. I mean, Google, Facebook, Amazon. Pick a company. It's really unbelievable. And this is really sensitive data. I mean, what we search for on Google is a big deal. It's super personal and unregulated. That data is just everywhere. In healthcare, we've done a very good job of protecting through laws like HIPAA and so on and so forth, protecting personal health information and ensuring that it has to be de-identified before anyone can get their hands on it. It has to be anonymized. There's very strict rules of what you can do. And I think the government did a pretty good job early on of saying, if data is going to flow in healthcare, we need to protect people's identities and make sure that there are safeguards. They didn't do that in other areas. And as a result, there's a lot of privacy breaches that I think all of us are uncomfortable with. But in healthcare, they've done a pretty good job.
Remzi, thoughts about those trade-offs between privacy and what we can learn and solutions we can find?
Yeah, I think Eric makes a really good point, and it's to some extent a frightening thing how much data a Google, a Facebook, a Twitter has about, really, I mean, every citizen. If you think about something like Facebook, I mean, all these companies have 1 billion plus users, 2 billion plus users. That's bigger than any country in the world. So at some point, it goes beyond a computer science problem, the area that I maybe know a little bit about, and becomes a much higher level problem around how do you regulate those things and keep them safe. You could imagine many frightening scenarios where if a company had that kind of information about everybody, but then was going out of business and then was just selling off information as part of their way of dealing with going out of business. Fortunately, we haven't had a case like that yet, and hopefully we'll get on top of this as a society before we have a bigger problem around everybody's privacy. I think Eric's example of what people search for, it just reveals so much about what's going on in your life, what things you type into Google all the time. There are people inside of computer science that work on maybe a narrower technical kind of approach to privacy. For example, some years ago, people developed techniques like one that's called differential privacy, where you can put data in a database and then allow people to query it. And by essentially preserving the data in a relatively intelligent way, make it so that when they get data out, they can't really narrow it down and find out specific things about you. And so this technology was developed some years ago in research labs, but it's increasingly seeing some usage, like inside of Apple, for example, who's, I think, been trying to be a leader in terms of privacy. So I think, kind of this two-pronged approach where on the technical side, increasing work in this space of privacy and security of data. I know every top computer science department, including ours, is working hard in that space. And then making sure the other side of the problem is addressed to this regulatory side of it, which is, again, way beyond my expertise. But I do feel like there's some need for us to pay attention to that a lot more before some big disaster occurs.
If I can just pop in for 1 second, it's really interesting. If you said to the average person, I'm going to take your Google searches over the last month and make them public, or think of that Amazon Echo, that little, dot in your house that listens to every single conversation you're ever having, or Siri for that matter. I'm going to take every conversation you've ever had, every private conversation, and make it public. Most people, versus your healthcare records, which are, for the vast majority of us, so ridiculously boring, filled with labs and whatever. Even if you have a whole myriad of issues, it's pretty benign for the vast majority of people. But what you do in your home, what you do on the internet, this is not benign. This is the essence of who we are and who we often want to protect. So it's weird that we go so far to protect whether somebody is hypertensive, but we go nowhere to protect all the crazy things that they are into or do, which you as a human would be like, that's a breach of privacy at the highest level.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. If I could chime in on that, I think I spent some time inside of Google on a sabbatical. My wife and I were out there, and so we got to be inside of a company there. And we know a number of people on the security side of that equation, and just, amazing people working there in security. And the only kind of good news on this is those companies know that if they have a security breach, that someone can get in and then report, oh, this is what, the latest political candidates were searching for the past so many months that they were using a computer. They know they would have such a huge problem that there's an incredible incentive to make sure the security is of the highest level. And I know those companies, all the big companies where all this data lives, have amazing security people, are constantly fending off attacks from other companies, from other governments, and have done it so far, at least, have done so mostly successfully. And so I think that's the slight, silver lining on that dangerous cloud that you're painting, is that there's a high incentive for the companies to make sure that people can get in there and extract that kind of information.
Yeah, it's super interesting. Sorry to keep, but it's really interesting. I mean, and I do think from a privacy law perspective, we have it wrong. We should be protecting what people search for more than healthcare data. But I couldn't agree more with you that even though Google and Facebook and Amazon have all the sensitive data, it couldn't be more safe. I mean, I was having a conversation once with somebody who worked very high up in the CIA, and they had just finished an internal study looking at their own data within their own environment relative to AWS. And they concluded that AWS, I think that people have written about this, so it's not like top secret, but AWS is far more secure, or places like Azure or whatever, Google Cloud Platform, GCP, all more secure, because when the vast majority of the security breaches were internal, they were people. So the best part about these companies is they're so big that even though they have your sensitive data, they have sensitive data for the whole world, and they just can't. They're not set up to do anything but protect that data. But it's crazy how much data is out there.
Yeah.
I hope they don't have one upset employee one day that has an incentive to ruin that. Let's hope that doesn't happen. Couple audience questions. I'm going to blend a few here from Sarah and Ellen. Sarah wonders whether data has failed us during COVID. I might ask whether data can fail people or only people can fail people. I don't know the data, but has data really helped us? And Ellen had a related question. Have there been key, maybe data science findings related to COVID-19 that haven't gotten enough attention or emphasis in recent months? I'd say, are we looking at the right things when we're looking at COVID? And Eric, I think you were alluding to the fact that it's very different for different people. And we probably, even by age, we know a lot about how different the impacts can be. Are we looking at the right stuff?
I mean, I think at a macro level, the agencies who look at this data, the CDC, the NIH, the FDA, are looking at the right stuff. Our problem with data in this country is a media problem, and it's a massive problem. And it's both sides. So I'm not here to blame Republicans or Democrats, but everyone is sensationalizing all of this data in such an unhealthy way that even though I can be watching national statistics and I can be watching the number of cases falling, I can be watching hospitalizations fall, I can be looking at deaths fall, I can be looking at case fatality rates fall, and you can feel pretty good that at least at a macro level, the U.S. is making real progress today versus where it was, let's say, in March or April or May. I can turn the news on any given day and be completely depressed, and it's not real, and it's both sides, not real to the good and not real to the bad. And it's not that they're trying to sell fake news, I don't think. It's just that they want to sell audience viewership, and it's very boring to talk about planes landing safely. And it's very exciting to talk about planes that almost crash. And so every day we just talk about planes almost crashing. And the problem is when you have hundreds of millions of people, one of the biggest lasting impacts of COVID, even after we have, I think, some amount of vaccines or antivirals, is we've scared the crap out of the American public. And that's not going to change quickly. You're not going to have people going to movies or going to football games with the same kind of velocity they did historically, because we've just terrified them. And I think that's that's a problem with how people can manipulate data.
Yeah, if I could jump in there, I think really good points. A couple points about the media. One is I remember the first time I read a newspaper article where I deeply knew the topic matter that I was reading about, and I was quite surprised that, of course, that a lot of the details were wrong. And then, of course, I went on and read the other articles, nodding my head and understanding. But I think that the second point is that I've never been able to figure out. I mean, obviously, this is not my realm of thinking generally, but just as a citizen, given, why is there sensationalism? It's to make money. And the computer era the data-driven era has really accelerated that with knowing so much about, hey, when the title of the headline is this in a news article, someone will click on it, right? That's data-driven news, is what will people click on? When they click on it, I can show more ads. When I can show more ads, I can make more money. I think the question that's really facing the world of journalism is, are there other business models other than, click-driven, ad-driven? And places have tried, getting subscriptions and charging and so forth, but they're still very connected to that ad-driven world. And unless that gets cleaved, I see that problem existing going on, right? It's always going to be connected to what gets people to focus in and watch the news. And like Eric said, I think very succinctly, it's the plane crashing, and it's not really representing what's going on in the world. And I think that's quite a big challenge for that world.
Well, one of the refreshing things about having guests like you is I think we get to talk about how many planes land safely, and it's important for people to know that. So in a nutshell, data aren't failing people. Media industry incentives may be failing people. I think that's probably a fair statement. Question from Deborah. How do data scientists help prevent data from being used maliciously to manipulate the public? And I guess we kind of touched on that. It's probably hard for data scientists to stop that, but maybe some of them do.
Well, I could say something about that. I mean, it's certainly a tough question. I think as Eric was talking about, there's a lot of data out there, and depending how you put it in front of people, it can be interpreted in 1,000 different ways. I do think, one thing that we've been thinking about here at the university is there's always a piece of that we can influence. So as we created a new data science major, which is an interesting blend. So we have computer science, the world that I came from, which is, many decades old and, developed around the worlds of how computers work and how to write computer algorithms and so forth. But there's this new world that came up that we've really been talking about all evening, which is really between computer science and statistics and some other areas, which people call data science. And machine learning blends into that area, though certainly is connected to both of those areas pretty well. And on campus, what we've done is we're just created a new major. So this will be, I think Mike talked about earlier how computer science is the largest major on campus. I expect data science will be an incredibly large major too. I also think it'll be an incredibly large double major, so that people will study data science and some domain that they're really interested in. And I think that's a really excellent combination for people going out in the world and wanting to study other things other than, say, computer or data science specifically. And what we're doing on the side to help with that, so that data scientists, when they share data with the world, that they do it in a good way, is from the very beginning, we designed really 3 pillars to the major. One is the computer science fundamentals, which come out of our department in CS, the statistics fundamentals, which come out of our compatriot department, the statistics department, and then ethics, making sure that ethics is a first day concern, from, data privacy to just how you present data, just making sure that the educational process isn't just about the technical, but it's also about the application, and how you think about that in an ethical way, I think is going to help shape that discussion. Of course, the problem is much bigger than just education. And I don't know if maybe Eric has some thoughts on that too. I think there's a much broader problem of how do you prevent malicious misuse of data. But I think we are doing a piece of that here at the university, which I'm pretty proud of.
I think you covered it.
Sounds good.
More of a business use question from Jim. Regarding data security, do companies, are they deeply interested in individual data, or are they looking at aggregate data to predict patterns? And if individual data, do they care to know, my name and everything, or is it just I'm consumer X? Do they need to know my name, or how would we anonymize people?
My wife to come on in just because I figured she's as long as she's here, she can kind of come hang out, given this is her home night. So I'm happy to give 2 minutes on, or a minute on that. So I think in general, companies just don't have the ability, to kind of, again, we talked about this a minute ago, but to peer inside individuals' data and attempt to do anything really deleterious with it. I mean, they could, but remember, I think Remzi said this, the average of these companies has somewhere between 1 billion and 2 billion users, right? Between Amazon and Microsoft and Google and Facebook. And so any one human is just so irrelevant unless you are Joe Biden or Donald Trump. And if to the extent that they want to breach your data, they would be, not only untrusted at a global level, but then subject to a ton of pressure. So I think the scale of these things makes them secure. The fact that there are massive institutional, now trillion-dollar businesses, and their job is to instill trust, and so they just don't tend to peer at each individual and look at what's going on. And when they do use your data, and they use your data a lot, they either use it to target ads, which is a fundamental part of their business, or they'll use it in the aggregate to get smarter about some other business line that they're running.
Yeah, so I think Eric said it basically, that they don't really care specifically about you generally. I think they also, one thing I've seen on the inside of those companies is an increasing number of safeguards and the better companies have done this earlier and better, but an increasing number of safeguards that make sure that random employees can't, go and look inside of particular people's accounts and data streams. You can imagine in the early days of those companies, I'm sure that wasn't true. Like when Google was a startup, I bet it was easy to poke around and find out stuff about people. But pretty soon they realized how dangerous that was, because that means just the one, like you said, the one disgruntled employee can be a problem then, right? And I think it's just increasingly hard. Now, it's not impossible. Like we saw this at Twitter not that long ago, right? Where Insider helped basically launch some tweets on some well-known accounts, and that cost people some money. And so that's always going to be a concern, but I think the companies are very, it's front and center for them to work on that and make sure that bad things don't happen.
Eric, we got a question from Claire that I think is best directed at you. Given what you said about the age of the molecule, what are the barriers to unlocking the next advancements in precision medicine? Is it policy or incentive related within the healthcare system? Is it technology related, or is it in getting the tools in the hands of providers real time?
The short answer is it can't be stopped. It's once you let the genie out of the bottle, you can't put the genie back. And so where we are today is that companies like Tempest have emerged that can use data to improve diagnostics and therapies, and they build business models around that, and there will be dozens or hundreds to follow, and eventually companies will find ways to permeate healthcare no different than they permeated entertainment and travel and every other industry.
So I mentioned earlier, this was the Michigan edition of our UW Now live stream. Eric, is Liz going to join us and make it a little more Wisconsin?
I tried to get her here to bring a little, to even it out between Remzi and I and Mike, but I couldn't get her fully. So.
Did you guys meet each other at all as undergraduates? You overlapped for a couple years, I think.
We did, but I mean, if we met, no offense, Eric, I don't remember.
It's a big school.
It's a big school.
It is a big school.
Just to be clear, there was one reason I went to Michigan. I grew up in Michigan, and my dad said, "You're going to Michigan." So I applied to one school.
Okay, well, there's one, by the way, and I love Michigan, but my dad gave me two choices: Michigan or Michigan State. You didn't have a ton of options back then. There was no such thing as like, what if I get into Harvard? It was like,
Yeah.
Michigan State, you pick.
Sounds like your dad was more liberal than mine. So.
Question from Vinny: will AI in medicine move beyond diagnosis and data analytics?
Yeah, I mean, AI in medicine will eventually, I think, permeate every ounce of healthcare, from diagnosis to therapy to how things are paid for. There won't be a single part of healthcare that AI isn't running within 20 years. And within 50 years, I don't think you'll make any decisions without connecting to AI. The average doctor will connect to AI at every turn.
What do you think that'll do to life expectancy?
It'll eradicate most diseases. So I mean, we're all probably in a similar band of age here. So I don't know. We may miss it, the three of us. Being on the wrong side of it.
Good news, bad news.
Yeah. But for sure, our kids, I think, are on the right side of it. With 100% certainty, their kids are on the right side of it. So, and so I think if you're 15 years old today, you got a really good chance of living to 110 or 120. More importantly, living to 90. Your 90 is going to feel a lot like 60, and that's kind of crazy to think about, because we think today of like 90 is like you're barely walking. It's very hard for the average 90-year-old to do anything that a 50 or 60-year-old could do. But that'll change. So we're getting close.
Boy, that's encouraging.
Well, almost.
I hope they can speed it up, Eric. Get going. I feel like I should let Eric go and get back to work.
I'm just going to have my wife say hi really quickly, because otherwise it wouldn't be fair.
Hi, all.
Hi, Liz.
Hello.
Thanks for finding this guy.
Now we're officially 50-50.
So, last question from Ben for both of you. Is there anything about the future of data, AI, and machine learning that kind of keeps you awake at night? What do you worry about? What could go wrong?
Well, that's a big question, and I guess I'm seeing it as what makes us maybe nervous, and also what makes us hopeful. And I think it has both of those flavors. So I think Eric will comment on this a little bit more, perhaps interestingly, because he's really focused on the applications of these technologies, and in the end, that's where we'll see a lot of all sides of it. I think any new technology that's introduced into the world, we always have to think about all sides of it. I think sometimes we're very good as technologists of putting forth ideas and putting forth technologies and inventions, and it's really easy to imagine the good outcomes, right? If you go back and you read it's really fascinating. I was, when I was in graduate school, this thing called the World Wide Web kind of got invented, right? And so, the internet was in place already. People were connecting together machines from around the world. In fact, the University of Wisconsin played a big role in that, some of the very early wide area networking work. And then the World Wide Web started to come into play, and everybody started imagining all these amazing things that are going to happen. We're going to be able to connect with each other, talk with each other, run businesses that connect across the world. I don't remember a single person talking about, and we're going to have elections that are influenced by foreign governments or any of that stuff. I think it's really hard to think about the negative impact. So the thing I'm hoping we're better able to do as we go forward is, as we're introducing one new idea after the other, is that we're able to have much more reasoned thinking about both the positives and the potential harms of those things. And I think we're still crawling out from that, still understanding the impacts on our political systems, certainly our medical systems, all those things of all this technology. And I think we still have a long way to go to get there.
Yeah, and what I would say is, at the end of the day, technology has just naturally had a profoundly positive impact. It's even though people kind of can pinpoint something that's negative, in the aggregate, it's just been so incredibly positive. And it's very hard to understand when I was young, I can tell you, growing up in Detroit, I was alive and young during the migration to the Japanese automotive companies, where, through robots and automation, everyone thought the US companies were going out of business, and that was the end of that. There'd be no General Motors and no Ford, and everything's going to go to Japan and blah, blah, blah. And here we are 30 years later, and the most valuable car company in the world is some guy out in Silicon Valley who invented a car company that's just worth as much as every car company combined almost. And it's just, when you think about technology, like who would have thought that this little tiny company called Tesla would kind of reinvent the car? And there will probably be somebody who reinvents Tesla and reinvents that company. And, at the end of the day, for all the talk about how technology is going to reduce jobs and cause havoc, we entered the pandemic with unemployment at an all-time low. It was like 3% or something. I mean, it had never been lower, at least in the last 100 years or 50 years. And yet we have so much technology. So I think people just have to kind of embrace it and realize that change is difficult, but typically it leads to more good than bad.
Yeah, we certainly are. Among the major economies of the world, we have the ability to reinvent ourselves like no other country. 5 of the biggest 10 companies in America by market cap were, founded after we were all born. I know you guys are that old, and that just doesn't happen in many parts of the world. Most countries, the top 10 have been the top 10 for a long time. There isn't much change, but here, there's a lot of dynamism, and there are a lot of reasons for that. That could be the subject of a whole nother show. But a couple of the reasons are a great education system producing guys like you and many others. And Remzi, I wish you great success with our new Center for Computing, Data, and Information. We're really pleased having you in there. And Eric, wish you all the best in your endeavors. You're working on really important stuff, and I hope we can stay in contact and find ways to work together in the future.
You guys are doing great stuff, so we're excited to be affiliated.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you both very much for a fantastic evening. I'd like to thank our audience for joining us again tonight. The UW Now will be back again on Tuesday, October 6th, with a special guest yet to be announced, but it'll be a very exciting show. And until then, you can hear more from UW experts next week. On Tuesday, September 29th, you can hear about the future of medicine on the Wisconsin Medicine Livestream series. And on Wednesday, you can join UW experts for Beyond Health, the social impacts of COVID-19. Thanks for being with us, and on Wisconsin.